Hello, beautiful people. It's time to learn about one more critical lens. And of course, there are a ton of them, but this is the third and final one we're going to learn about for this unit. It's called the race lens. It is also often called like the ethnicity lens. You could also maybe hear it called the culture lens, but for the sake of this, we're going to base it off of a very large idea called critical race theory, and we're going to study what's called the race lens. We study the race lens because, first of all, it's very relatable and relevant, especially in 2021. The lives of you, the world, the conversations about race have been going on for a really long time and will, in a good way, I think, continue to go on for a really long time. You have sufficient background knowledge to do this work. This race lens, I think, is very a companion lens to studying youth, gender, and lots of other different types of critical lenses that you might study in the future. It allows you to practice the skills of critically thinking, which means not just going into something and believing whatever it is that you're told, but actually thinking about it and wondering what you're being fed as you're reading, and it allows you to see hidden author bias that might be there. The race lens means that when reading a book, and with this lens, you're going to ask yourself to consider whether or not different characters' races, and that of course can be Jude, the protagonist, or an older character, or really anyone, whether their race is represented fairly in your opinion, and you're also going to critically analyze how the author is subliminally making comments about race or about that race through the way they craft that or those characters. The opening question I want you to ask yourself is, what is your base understanding of race? Did you watch the video in the learning slides yet? There is this really amazing video that actually this woman from PBS published and did. That's only about 10 minutes long, and it's very interesting. I learned a lot through watching it, and I thought that in addition to just knowing the definition of race, what the word means, which I think we can often just spout off definitions really easily, it's a really awesome idea to, I think, anthropologically understand where the term came from and not only the term, but how has the idea evolved over time? And I think PBS is a really reliable source. I think the historian and the anthropologist that is giving us her understanding of race over the course of a few centuries in the United States is super knowledgeable. So the other video in the learning slides, I think would be awesome to maybe pause this and watch that right now if you haven't. I want you to take a moment to understand the definition of race just from Merriam-Webster. And I realize that definitions evolve over time, and if you look up the definition of race, there are 6 or 7 core definitions of race. A lot of them I think are related, and so I picked one that I thought was the most concise that related to what we were talking about, and that is a group of people sharing a common cultural, geographical, linguistic, meaning language, or religious origin or background. There's this really great video I literally just said on the previous slide that kind of talks about how the definition of race, especially in the United States, but over the last 400 or 500 years has evolved. So before you dive into just talking about race, no matter how comfortable you are with talking about it, it's really important to know what you're talking about and what the definition of it is. Our ideas about race, just like youth and age, just like gender, are absolutely constructed not only by what we hear and what we take in from those that we respect, but the way that we see it portrayed in movies and TV shows and books. It's so important in literacy to understand what am I being fed because of a lot of times, fictional stories that are constructed by authors. We make up these truths in our mind because of repeated images and repeated things we've heard time after time. And we have to ask ourselves, are these truths that I hold valid? Are these things that especially sometimes when you're growing up, you see a lot of things and you hear a lot of things because of your family, and those things may be awesome, right? But I think the older that you get, one big part of critical lens is that, and as an adult, what you would hope to strive for, and I'm constantly working on, and Miss Leslie's constantly working on, is saying, do I think this is a really good way to represent this race or this gender or this age? And in this specific critical lens, we're going to deconstruct and say, do I really feel as if the person writing this book has the authority to be writing about this race in the way they do? And are they representing them in a way that's just perpetuating a stereotype? Are they going against the norm of how we normally see these types of characters? And those are the types of things you're going to ask yourself. So as you would assume, the next slide here is really just a lot like the other two lenses and the questions you're going to ask yourself. How does the author, in this case Jasmine Warga, represent the character's race directly? You can pick any character. You can also talk about multiple characters. What might be interesting is to talk about two different characters that are of different races. And sometimes this might be actually difficult to understand in a book. How do we know this character is white? How do we know this character is African American? How do we know this character is Latina? Like, how do we know that? And sometimes in books, it's kind of like we know sometimes more about the race because of how they're spoken or maybe the locations they reference. There might be a lot of indirect ways we know a person's race, but it might be trickier to find. Maybe in the beginning of the book might be sometimes the easiest place to find those direct traits and how we know a person's race. What can we then infer the author is trying to say about that race based on how he or she is creating that character, the thoughts, the feelings, the actions of that character because they are of that race? What is the author inferring is a truth about that race or people of that race because of that character acting like that? Question 3, in real life, do you feel like people of the same race act the way that that character does? Do you feel like that is a reality that you see as yourself in Coralville, Iowa, and of course other places you might have lived and experienced? Do you feel like this is an accurate representation of this particular race because of your experience and your perspective? And in question 4, do you feel like you see this type of character because of looking at their race? Do you feel like you see people acting like this in other books and other movies? Like, do you feel like this is a common representation of this race that you see, or do you feel like this is a fresh new idea or something that contradicts things that you have seen? So after you ask yourself those questions, open up your last, of course, you'll have the guide as well, but you're going to watch or read, the last section of Other Words for Home, and you're going to apply this race lens to that last section. And of course, you can obviously use text evidence from the whole book in order to talk about what you've seen, especially I know because in Other Words for Home, the concept of race and especially the culture around race, like people talk about how people sometimes fit in or don't fit in or feel awkward around other people because of those new traditions or those new things that they've got to learn, whether it's the way that they speak or the way, the things they can relate to or not relate to, right? So when you are opening up this race lens document and you're annotating these notes while you read, at the end of it, on that Thursday when Guide 4 is due, you're also going to share your lesson 4 with your teacher. Email us if you have any questions, or obviously ask us in class if you need any clarification. Good work.